might not have been looking at these particular stories of the kings with an idea, with a thought in mind as to what it was this story was trying to tell. And his thought was, they had these oral traditions, these stories they had been told since they were children, some things that had actually been written down about the kings, particularly David, because he was their golden boy. He was the one who was everything to everybody. And so they had these stories, but now they were in Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. And they were not there because they wanted to be. They were there because the Babylonian Empire had arisen to power in the world at that time and had taken their people to Babylon, because that was a common thing that kingdoms did back in those days, is when you conquered someone, you took the people and you took them to another place. And I'll get into that in a little bit more. So he thinks that these people were in captivity and they were thinking, how did we get here? How did we get here? And so they looked back at their history and they found a through line, which was disobedience and rebellion. So Martin Noth thinks there was an author or a group of authors working in the late 7th century before Christ who were taking these different sources and traditions and put them into a single body of work to explain why the people were in exile. And it begins with the law given to Moses in Deuteronomy and shows how the people, the priests, and especially the kings began to disobey the law given in Deuteronomy, with the consequence that they lost the land and ended up in Babylon. They had been given the land in the stories of Joshua and the Judges, the book of Judges. And those stories we read about how God brought them from Egypt in a 40-year sojourn in the wilderness into the land that God had promised their ancestors. They conquered the land. The land was given to them. It was theirs. Yay! But because of rebellion and disobedience, they lost it. The Babylonian captivity was a process of deportation. It was a system pioneered by the Assyrians in which a large group of people from a particularly obstinate or rebellious territory would be forcibly removed under the idea that they would be a productive but not rebellious a bunch of people in the empire if they were taken to the capital. And in some cases, other deported people would be re-deported and put in place. So there was just kind of this, it was sort of like somebody took a bowl in the ancient Middle East and went, and everybody who started out in one place wound up in another place, and people who were in that place were put in that place, and it was just a whole mishmash, a great deal of misidentity and rootlessness. So, that's kind of the backstory of where we are with this story in Samuel 8, and the stories that we will be reading through the rest of the summer in the Old Testament. So this story in Samuel 8, gosh, it's kind of like everything old is new again, huh? This Samuel story last week began with Eli's sons being corrupt and Eli being old, and now here we have Samuel, who is old, and his sons are corrupt. Everything old is new again was a song that was used in the 1977 movie All That Jazz, and it kind of sort of fits with that opening right there. There's a lyric in that song that says, let's go forward, let's go backward when forward fails. So, Samuel has been judge for some time now. 40 to 50 years have passed between last week's story of Samuel being called and today's story of Samuel being an old man. His position had been a very complex one. He was a religious leader, he was an intercessor, he was a prophet, he was a dispenser of justice, and there are some stories that he himself actually led some of the military sorties out into the countryside. But now here, toward the end of Samuel's life, Israel is once again in a precarious position. It seems like it was just sort of a never-ending cycle for God's people. Things were great, things were bad, things were great, things were bad, and now we find ourselves in a bad place. Samuel's two sons, who he has appointed judges, were corrupt, did not share his father's reputation. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the Philistines, the people who lived on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast, were opposing a military threat to Israel, and Israel's success at withstanding that threat depended on their leaders. They didn't have any at that point in time. I don't really have a third hand, but and in addition, the Philistines had technological advantages over Israel, and some of their practices, particularly their religious practices, were sneaking their way into Israel's own worship practice. All of this means that Israel's prospects after Samuel's death were not good. So they came to come to Samuel and they say some things. The Philistines were powerful people. And at one point in time, the Israelites thought, hey, we have this powerful artifact called the Ark of the Covenant. Let's take that out, and that will give us power to defeat the Philistines. Well, it didn't work. The Philistines still beat them, and they took the Ark. So, okay, here we are. Samuel's old. He's old. And they come to him and they say, you're old. You're a leader and you're old. And we don't trust your replacements. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? You're old, we don't trust your replacements, we don't think we have these serious threats at our border. We're going to be invaded by outsiders. We are scared. We are terrified. We want a strong person to lead us. Again, doesn't this sound familiar? It's like we never learn. So 3,000 years ago, this was still an issue. So the elders come to Samuel and they say, give us a king. Like everybody else has a king. Maybe we'll stand a chance if we have a king. And Samuel was upset by this. A website that I frequent called So Much Bible, which does text analysis of the original language, says that the word in Hebrew is Samuel was displeased, ra'ah. It means something that is spoiled, something that is broken into pieces. It can also mean something has been called worthless. It's something that can do harm or punish or irritate. So the Israelites, the elders of the Israelites, God's chosen and set apart people, want to be like everybody else, they say to Samuel. And Samuel recognizes when they come to him and say, we want a king, and he no longer has any part of leading the people. So Samuel goes to God, because that's what you do when you're upset. And he says, they want a king. They want to be like everybody else. And God says to Samuel to look beyond his own skinned nose, because it's not you, Samuel. I'm the one being rejected. From the start, God's people were shaped and sustained through God's covenants. And we looked at the covenants through this winter, what the covenants were. Kazimiera Fraley, writing a plain account, says that the Hebrew people had been working for, dying for, suffering for the Pharaohs. Then God came and brought them out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, and took them to Sinai, where God made a covenant, a promise to be their God and to lead them to the land that God had promised to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. On Sinai, God promised to protect them, to guide them, to be their God. They promised to be God's people. They would live as God called them to live, by God's laws and by God's ordinances, to love and obey God in all things. God was to be their ruler, and they were to be God's people. God would give them human leaders. God had given them Moses, and then Joshua, and then later the judges, Ehud, Deborah, Gibeon, Samson, and now Samuel himself. God had never left them alone, had never disappointed or failed to be anything less than whom God had promised to be. And they didn't want it anymore. The word rejected in Hebrew is ma'as, which means to reject or to refuse, to despise, to disdain, to spurn. It can also be understood to be to disappear or to melt away, kind of like snow and sunshine. So the people turn from God, and for them, that relationship with God melts away. Okay, God says, that's a way forward, and that is a way you want to go. But Samuel, I want you to solemnly warn the people what that will look like. And so Samuel comes back and he says, okay, folks, this is what you want. This is what it will be like when you serve the king. Service can be working for or being compelled to work for. It can also be understood as being tilling or cultivating. It can even mean to be enslaved or kept in bondage. The implication is clear. By wanting a king, the people are relinquishing that unique relationship they had had with God to that point and will be going backward, because forward's not working so well, so we're going to go backward to when their ancestors served Pharaoh. Be careful what you ask for. In chapter 9, Yahweh arranges a meeting between Samuel and Saul, and Samuel anoints Saul to be king. In chapter 10, some of the people are not on board with Saul because Saul is this nobody from the tribe of Benjamin. Wow, that's a theme that will come back again and again. And in the first part of chapter 11, Saul leads a group of Israelites into a strategic victory against the Philistines, and then the people are now wholly behind him. Yay! This is a great warrior! Plus, he's tall and good looking. So, in verses 14 and 15 in chapter 11, Saul is anointed king in front of all the people, and they rejoice. Yay! They got what they asked for. Now, it might not have taken a whole lot of connection for you all to see how this story of the people coming to Samuel saying, give us a strong leader, connects with our own world, our own fears of the future. People want protection, particularly from external threats, and people want the benefits that they will reap from a strong leader that provides that security. We're going to put up a fence around us. We're going to have this big guy out there with search towers and armed guards, and we're going to be prosperous. And to get this, people have to bargain away some things. We have to pay a price with limits on internal freedom and personal resources. The king will take your stuff. The king will take 1/10 of your stuff. Remember where 1/10 is supposed to go? 1/10 is supposed to go to God. The king will take the Lord's tithe for his own purposes. The king will take your sons. The king will take your daughters. They will serve the king. The counter argument to all of that is, yeah, but we'll still have our whatever it is that you want, that you're fighting so hard to hold on to. We'll still have our bank accounts. We'll still have our retirement pensions. We'll still have what is important to us. So important to us that we'll serve someone who does not serve us. Okay, great. But where is God in that arrangement? Beth Elnis Hansen, writing at Working Preacher, says, while it seems that God's warning centers on issues of conscription and taxes, the real issue is in whom the people of God will trust. The red thread of this story is that Yahweh is to be the sole relationship in whom to put one's trust. If the people of God don't trust God, there will be consequences. Conscription and taxes are the light version of those consequences, and exile and imprisonment is the heavy one. This story of the people, an ancient people, 3,000 plus years ago, coming to an old leader whose successors nobody trusts, again, familiar, coming to them and saying, give us a king. So the question for them is, who do you trust? The question for us is, who do we trust? There's another Old Testament lesson for today from Genesis 3. The story of how the serpent comes into the garden and whispers things in the ears of the humans, planting seeds of doubt in that human couple that God is keeping secrets from you, beginning to chip away at that absolute trust that they had. That lesson and this lesson today shed light on what trust is. In this story, people want to put their trust in an earthly king, and God relents to that, allowing them, challenging them to demonstrate the core of their trust. Is it going to be placed in their king? Will they continue to rely on their trust in God and God's promises, God's covenants that God has never walked away from? Sometimes people talk about the wrath of God coming in to punish sinners. You know what the real wrath of God is? Allowing someone to live with the consequences of their decisions. That's what you want? Okay. That's what you'll have. Underlying that question of trust is also an issue of fear. The elders in this story are afraid they will be stuck with Joel and Abijah, and fear is a great strategy that the evil one uses at any point, at any time, in anyone to undermine trust. This isn't just the Old Testament stories from the past. This is the story of our lives today. Fear gets a foothold because we can't trust God to rule as God. And we may have gotten to the point where we don't even trust God to be there. So the title of today's sermon is Be Careful What You Ask For. And I think we need to emphasize the word careful. Because sometimes we do need to ask God for things. And so maybe what we need to do is be aware of what specifically it is we need. Do we need something specifically to improve in a relationship? Do we need something specifically to help us get through the day? Dig down, find out what that specific thing is that you need, and when you find it, name it, and then give it to God. And ask God to listen. Interesting thing, the word ask. Do people come to Samuel and ask for something? The word ask in Hebrew is sha'al. Saul. They got a king. They got what they asked for. And even if it isn't what's best for us, God will respond to what we ask for. And maybe the other thing about being careful about what we ask for is when we ask to remember what God has done for us in the past. Where have we experienced God's abiding presence in the past? And where did we find resources or answers that we weren't expecting? Where God says, hey, I've been here, just ask. Like the elders coming to Samuel, the first believers, the very first Christians, faced their own uncertain future for a variety of reasons. And Paul writes to them, particularly to the Christians in Corinth, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, offering them some hope. He reminds them and us that the circumstances surrounding us may make us feel like we have to make some shaky bargains in order to secure our future. But he says this to them and to us: we have this treasure in earthenware pots, so that the extraordinary quality of power can be shown to belong to God, not us. We are under all kinds of pressure, but we're not crushed. We are at a loss, but not at our wits' end. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are cast down, but not destroyed. God allows us to make our own decisions for our future. And even when those decisions are a little, God won't abandon us to them. We get to live with the consequences of those decisions sometimes, always. And sometimes we think, oh, maybe that wasn't the best option. Let me ask again, being a little more careful about what I want. God's promises to be with us when we get to the future, and God promises to go with us along the way. Trusting God, it's not easy. It's hard sometimes. But trusting is what we are called to do. To depend on God. To be who God says God will be. To do what God says God will do in all things and at all times. So as we move into our futures, let's take care what we ask for. Thanks be to God. Hallelujah and amen.